There are a lot of conflicts in the Middle East happening in the recent past, within the last 100 years or so, and the root cause of these conflicts, whether people like to admit it or not, are the Zionists. The creation of the Zionist state of Israel has led to so much death and destruction all across the Middle East and destabilized the entire region. What has happened to the Palestinian Arabs is one of the biggest injustices in the modern century, along with the Holocaust. This is ironic because the victims of the Holocaust are the perpetrators of what has been done to the Palestinian Arabs. I'm going to explain what Zionism is and how the so-called State of Israel came into being. Israel has performed many acts of deception since Zionism began, and to this very day continues with their deception. The Zionists could not have succeeded in destroying the Middle East had it not been for the British and their American and Western allies. Hence I consider them all equally guilty. All of the Zionist State of Israel's wars that it has waged, Israel always plays the victim and initiates every war, while fooling the world that Arabs just want to exterminate them for no apparent reason. The hatred of Israel by the Arabs stems from the Zionists stealing Palestinian land and ethnically cleansing them, committing massacres, using terrorist tactics to frighten Palestinians so that they would leave their villages for these colonizers to take over. Israel has been involved in many deceptive operations, from Jews dressing up as Arabs to bomb Egyptian targets to 9/11. 9/11 was a joint operation between Israel and the USA using their Al-Qaeda proxies in the hijackings. The USA created Al-Qaeda to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was known as Mujahideen back then, and the US referred to Osama bin Laden himself as a Soviet warrior. The USA financed, trained, and armed Al-Qaeda back then. They financed, trained, and armed them recently as well, in the Syrian and Libyan wars, and the so-called Arab Spring. What followed 9/11 was the Iraq War, which was completely based on lies and deception, and the so-called War on Terror, which gave the Israelis and their American puppets unlimited reason justified by themselves to launch a war against the Middle East. Zionism is the ideology where Jews believe that they have a right to the land of Palestine because some 2,000 years ago God had given them the land and they were expelled by the Romans, not even Palestinians, according to their own religious books. Zionism has been an idea since 1896, where Theodor Herzl proposed it. However, the problem with this idea of Jews taking over Palestine was that it was already inhabited by Palestinian Arabs who have been living there for thousands of years. Jews were less than 3% of the population of Palestine, and this is documented in Ottoman statistics. Furthermore, a 1920 report by the British Mandate in Palestine stated that there were 700,000 people living in Palestine, or about 10% of them were Arabs. The 10% Jewish population had almost all entered Palestine in the last 40 years. There were only a handful of Jews prior to 1850. Jews migrated to Palestine from Europe, mainly, and other parts of the world, so that they could fulfill their racist Zionist dream of taking over the area. They evicted Palestinians from their homes, murdered them, raped them, and terrorized them, village by village, blowing up houses, executing as many villagers as they could. There are many cases where even when Palestinians surrendered with white flags, entire villages were executed. A famous example is the Deir Yassin massacre, where over 100 Palestinian villages, including women and children, were executed by the Irgun and Lehi Jewish terrorist groups. This is extremely troubling, as the Palestinians in Deir Yassin actually made a peace pact with the Jews and turned away any armed militants that would try to defend their village to maintain the peace pact. But guess what? That didn't stop the Jewish terrorists from taking control of the village and committing these massacres. Deir Yassin was an example for the Palestinian Arabs of what awaited them had the rest of them stayed in their own villages. They would meet a similar fate. The Zionist Jews continued expelling, executing, and terrorizing and raping Palestinians until they had control over a large number of villages and land. They also placed mines outside the villages they took over to prevent the Palestinians coming back. After the so-called State of Israel was formed in 1948, Arab countries surrounding them finally decided to try to do something about the Zionists. However, there were some major problems with Arabs. Despite Arabs vastly outnumbering Jews in terms of people, the amount of actual combat troops Arab countries sent was so abysmal. It's actually laughable. Israel had 117,500 military soldiers, and Arab countries only sent around 60,000 total combined troops. This was a major mistake. The Arab countries surrounding Israel did not put much effort at all into the war. In fact, the Jordanian government, which was the strongest Arab government at the time, was hesitant to even engage in a war, and even made a deal with the Zionists that they would selfishly get the West Bank and wouldn't participate in the war any further. The Iraqi government was in a similar situation. The Arab countries were not so enthusiastic about going to war, hence they only sent a small number of pocket troops, which was a mistake. Furthermore, they had no unified command and were hence disorganized. This does make sense, however, and is somewhat excusable, as they were all very young countries. The British and French had colonized the Arabs and drew their borders, and their governments were recently formed. Arabs had made an incorrect judgment by forming an alliance with the British colonizers who promised them independence from the Ottoman Empire if they rebelled against the Ottomans. This was a mistake, as the British backstabbed the Arabs and gave Palestine to foreign European Jews and other Jews from across the world, as evident by the Balfour Declaration. If only the Arabs had actually read and followed the Quran, they would not have been in this giant mess in the Middle East right now. Quran Surah 5 verse 51 clearly says, "O you who have believed, do not take the Jews and the Christians as allies. They are in fact allies of one another. And whoever is an ally to them among you, then indeed he is one of them. Indeed Allah guides not the wrongdoing people." This is a key verse that's extremely relevant today. The Christian-Jewish alliance today is clearly Zionism. Israel and their American and European friends are the number one enemy of all Arabs and Muslims. After the State of Israel was formed, Palestinians now live as refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and elsewhere. The creation of the Zionist state forced Palestinian refugees into Lebanon, which completely destabilized the country and led to a 15-year-long civil war. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was corrupt in ways even though they had the correct ideology of anti-Zionism, formed a base in Lebanon and started attacking Israel. Israel then invaded Lebanon, and the PLO was driven out of Lebanon. However, Israel stayed long after the PLO was already gone. They had plans since the early days of Ben Gurion, where the Zionists had stated that they sought to annex southern Lebanon up to the Litani River and create a Christian state to the north of the Litani River. Thankfully, Hezbollah, a well-trained guerrilla group funded by Iran, emerged during this war and drove the Zionists out of southern Lebanon. Had it not been for Hezbollah, Lebanese people would now be speaking Hebrew as their official language, which is a freaking ugly language, by the way, and South Lebanon would be occupied and taken over by the Zionists, just like Palestine. Before I get into 9/11, we first need to know what we are dealing with here. The Zionists will use any means to achieve their goals, deceptive or open means, violent and non-violent means. Deceptive operations are a specialty of the Israelis. Between April 1950 and June 1951, the Zionists bombed their own Jews and Jewish targets in Baghdad, Iraq. They did this for two main reasons. The first is they wanted Jews in Iraq and elsewhere across the world to flee their countries and move to the newly created State of Israel and help them continue to colonize the land they stole from the Palestinians. The second is they wanted to portray to the world that Jews are innocent victims, and the only place they can be safe is in the so-called State of Israel. The Lavon Affair, or Operation Susanna, was conducted in Egypt in 1954 by Jews as a false flag operation. A group of Egyptian Jews were recruited by Israeli military intelligence to plant bombs inside Egyptian, American, and British-owned civilian targets, cinemas, libraries, and American educational centers. The bombs were timed to detonate several hours after closing time. They were trying to blame Arabs for the operation to achieve their own goals of creating violence and instability, which would force the British occupiers to retain control of the Suez Canal. There are also incidents such as the famous USS Liberty, where Israel bombed their own American allies' ship. Israel treats al-Qaeda in hospitals openly in the recent Syrian war. They, however, refuse to treat Hezbollah fighters because they don't fight in Israel's favor. This proves this is not about morals or righteousness to them. It's a geopolitical game. Whoever benefits them will be used by them, whether they are al-Qaeda, ISIS, or whatever they are. These are just some examples and by no means an exhaustive list of deceptive Zionist operations. 9/11 was a catalyst for USA involvement in the Middle East, which the Zionist Israelis were trying to achieve. Israeli influence on the USA is no secret and widely known, as the two are very close allies and are complicit in each other's crimes in the Middle East. As Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says, and I quote, "America is a thing you can move very easily. Move it in the right direction. They won't get in the way." There are pieces of evidence available to the public that indicate Israeli involvement in the operation. It's important to keep one thing in mind when viewing the events of 9/11. Al-Qaeda and governments like the USA and Israel are not entirely separate. Both of these countries will use Al-Qaeda or any other Islamist group so long as it suits their agenda. As said previously, the USA created, funded and armed the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, called Osama bin Laden a warrior, and even after 9/11, during the Libyan and Syrian wars, they again armed and supported the Al-Qaeda and other Salafist rebels to overthrow governments they, or rather Israel, doesn't like in this case. The Syrian government is allied with Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran. Israel sees Hezbollah and Iran as mortal enemies, hence why they and their American puppets support these groups to overthrow the Syrian government. During the events of 9/11, a group of 5 Israelis, Sivan Kurzberg, Paul Kurtzberg, Yaron Shemel, Oded Elna, and Omer Mamari, were caught filming and celebrating as a plane hit the first tower. They were already there, cameras and equipment were already set up and were ready to film the attack. The men were detained by the New York Police Department. The police and FBI field agents found maps of the city with certain places highlighted, box cutters, the same items that the hijackers allegedly used, $4,700 of cash stuffed in a sock, and foreign passports. Police also told a New Jersey local paper, the Bergen Record, that bomb-sniffing dogs were brought to the van and that they reacted as if they had smelled explosives. According to the Jewish Daily Forward, the FBI later determined that at least 2 of the Israelis were Mossad agents, and that their employer, Urban Moving Systems, was a Mossad front. Witnesses had seen these men set up cameras prior to the first plane strike even hitting, and when these Israelis later appeared on an Israeli talk show, they said they were there to document the event. How did they even know there was going to be an event to document? There was also another van driven by Israelis with explosives that had a mural of planes hitting the towers on the side, and it was destined to blow up the Washington Bridge. The van was stopped and apprehended and later whitewashed by the mainstream media and never mentioned again. All of the white vans belonged to the company Urban Moving Systems under the direction of Dominic Suda, who is an Israeli spy who immediately fled to Israel after the attacks. Urban Moving Systems was a front for the Mossad. There is more evidence linking Israelis to 9/11 that I won't go into right now, but these pieces of evidence alone, and judging by Israel's past covert actions that I went over previously, Operation Susanna, the 1950-51 Baghdad bombing, etc., indicate that 9/11 was an Israeli operation, or at the least there was some Israeli involvement in the 9/11 operation. What followed 9/11 was the Iraq War, which was completely based on lies and unjustified. Iraq had no WMDs, nor did they have any link to Al-Qaeda. The US administration had already made up their mind to invade Iraq, and invented their own lies to do it, and garner support, which Americans would now be accepting of due to their bloodthirst after the 9/11 operation. They tried to link Iraqi officials to Al-Qaeda by saying that they had met with Al-Qaeda in Prague, Czech Republic, and exchanged a bottle of anthrax with them, which we now know to be completely false. They also said Iraq had WMDs And by WMDs, they made the public believe Iraq had nuclear weapons by making statements such as mushroom cloud, which again was completely false. The Niger forgeries was another example of US officials trying to falsely push this narrative. The Niger uranium forgeries were forged, emphasis on the word forged, documents initially released in 2001 by SISMI, the former military intelligence agency of Italy, which seemed to depict an attempt by Saddam Hussein in Iraq to purchase yellowcake uranium powder from Niger during the Iraq disarmament crisis. On the basis of these documents and other indicators, the governments of the United States and the UK asserted that Iraq violated United Nations sanctions against Iraq by attempting to procure nuclear material for the purpose of creating weapons of mass destruction. If Iraq actually had WMDs, they would never have been invaded because the USA would have been scared of how Iraq could respond against Israel. There is a reason why the USA would never invade North Korea, for example, as they have nuclear deterrence, and the USA would only invade easy targets. Iraq was becoming the biggest military threat to Israel at the time, so the USA had to invade them to protect Israel's interests in the region and keep Israel as a regional power. There is more to cover on this topic, but that is a basic summary of the Middle East for anyone that's interested in what's going on. The best move forward would be if the Arab countries cut all ties to the USA in Israel. This means Saudi Arabia stopped trading with the USA and pegging oil to the USD and assisting them with their foreign policy, and other Arab states cutting all ties. Further, Arab states should form an alliance with Russia and China and whoever else is opposed to the West in Israel. Iran should pursue a nuclear deterrence and continue arming guerrilla resistance groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. The aim should be for these guerrilla groups to get more advanced weapons as well as such precision-guided missiles and anti-air defense systems. Iran is the only Middle Eastern country that has a correct foreign policy. The other Arab states just perpetuate Arab suffering with their foreign policy and stances. These guerrilla groups like Hamas and Hezbollah are actually a very effective answer to Israel's much more advanced military. They prevent Israel from occupying their territory. Had it not been for Hezbollah and Hamas, Israel would still be occupying South Lebanon and Gaza. In fact, the current colonization and evictions still going on in the West Bank are because there is no Hamas over there to fight the Israeli soldiers. Also, the rocket attacks by Hamas in the recent wars, while you may think their effectiveness has been neutralized because of the Iron Dome, which is Israel's anti-rocket system built to intercept the homemade rockets of Hamas with missiles, has been so overhyped by the media. Although this is far from the case, they claim a 90% success rate, which does not make any sense. The 2008 to 2009 Gaza conflict, no Iron Dome existed, and 3 Israeli civilians were killed. In the 2014 conflict, the Iron Dome exists and intercepted 90% of Hamas rockets, allegedly, and 6 Israeli civilians were killed. So what gives? Didn't the Iron Dome block 90% of Hamas rockets? So why is the amount of Israeli civilian deaths doubled? Also, it costs $80,000 to intercept a $300 Hamas rocket. Even if that rocket were to land, it would not do $80,000 worth of damage. In conclusion, if Arabs were to stop the Zionists, they need to build up their military capabilities and rethink their alliances. As I stated, cutting off all Western nations and Israel from all relations and look to Russia in the East instead, while providing more sophisticated weaponry to guerrilla groups like Hamas and Hezbollah.